Thank you.
So, hello again. we met each other. So it's great to see here so many people in this room interested in learning more about collaboration. And I couldn't have a better guest to explore that than Stefan Dobrev, the chairman of EIT. And Stefan has been at the center of how Europe thinks about innovation. So we will talk a bit around where we have come from the past, let's say. What's happening now in Europe in terms of deep tech innovation and what needs to change moving forward, especially when it comes to research and how it impacts the real world. So, Stefan, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Pedro.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about yourself and the EIT for the audience.
Thank you. So, I think of myself as a concierge of innovation. I like to help technology turn into a money-making machine. I've done this in private equity, I've done this in consumer goods companies, and now it's a great privilege to lead the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. For the few of you who have never heard of us, we mobilize public and private funds, we are a European Union body, to bring together researchers, industry, entrepreneurs, and make sure that the wonderful knowledge that we create in Europe, the publications, the patents, actually find their way to the market, find their way to the citizens and consumers of the Union, and ultimately make money. And that's one of the biggest gaps in our competitiveness in Europe, and we are committed to closing it.
Good, awesome. So let's start with that. So we know that in Europe we have a problem, right? So we have a challenge at least. So how, from your perspective, how did Europe historically approach the deep tech and its commercialization, and what we could have done better? What were basically the main challenges that we passed on, and what we could have made better, and what can we do better?
So historically, we were always very good at developing new ways of thinking, new technologies. We have some of the most spectacular publicly funded academic institutions in the world. In your talk before, you mentioned Oxford, Cambridge, ETH. Unlike the universities in other parts of the world, those are funded by the taxpayer. This, however, also gave them a certain freedom not to look too closely at the applied side of things. Conversely, we have historically had some very big companies that had very big research departments. And a lot of the technology, a lot of what you now might term deep tech, was actually created in corporate research. The collaboration between the two was never really high on the agenda because it never had to be. So you'd have Eindhoven and Philips developing what is now ASML. The university came after the corporate research. You have ETH patenting some wonderful work on what would now be deep tech. The IBM Research Center down the road, well, they hired a few of the researchers, that was about it. So this collaboration, this link between the two never quite worked. And it got worse when a lot of the inventions in academia didn't quite find their way to the big established companies. When you actually needed a startup to monetize what you've just invented in your PhD. Because then we suddenly realized in Europe, we don't really like this risk stuff. You know, this thing about, oh, I could fail. No, not for us. You know, that's something Americans do. And the gap between research and commercialization became even bigger.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's very true that basically historically the real breakthroughs from the market came from the corporate world. What do you believe why did the corporations stop to do that? Because the public funding had something to do with it? Because something that I see now is that often the corporations are expecting some sort of public funding in order to fund innovation. Do you think that that played a role in that?
Indirectly. So what I think what really did happen was that a lot of companies that were prepared to take the risk of innovating over the decades got under substantial pressure from the investors. And actually, the R&D department is often the first one to go if the pressure builds up and if things are deemed too risky. Somebody had to pick up the slack. Somebody had to pick up this risk-taking investment. And fortunately, this was actually the public purse. So it's almost the other way around, that the companies gave up on the R part of R&D, and luckily, public funding picked it up. But picked it up in a disconnected way. Picked it up in a way that meant that not everything that was invented in a lab could now find its way to the market.
All right, clear. So, what is different today in how, let's say, Europe supports deep tech startups? So, we know that in the past, we relied on this big corporation, and now we want scientific output to come from universities, but also to support startups. And one of the things that I honestly observe a lot is that in research centers, in research institutions, we have tremendous scientists, but they are not so willing to create companies. So they want to license their scientific breakthroughs, and most of the times too early. So what is EIT, or what is Europe through EIT doing in this regard today to help this science coming from the lab?
So there are two key dimensions that we are trying to address. One is, maybe start with the second challenge you highlighted, is what's going on in the heads of young researchers when they have a commercial opportunity. Do I have the skills? Do I have the attitude to make a business out of it? So the notion of upskilling, of the entrepreneurial skills we need across Europe is very close to our mission. And a lot of what we do has to do with giving willing entrepreneurs the skills and the ways of thinking to make a business out of their ideas. And I think this is something which all member states recognize. This is something which certainly the European Union has recognized is a big gap. Skills, of course, is only half of it. The other half is culture. Do people have the desire to take risk, the courage to take risk, the enjoyment to take risk? And this is, to some extent, part of answering your second question. What is different nowadays?
Yeah.
Europe is a lot bigger than it was 20 years ago. The so-called new member state that are not so new anymore, I come from one, we sit in another. They bring a different attitude to entrepreneurship and risk than some of the more established, wealthier countries that in some ways have less to lose. So on balance, the culture in Europe is much more dynamic, much more entrepreneurial than it used to be. Now, what can we do as the EIT? What can we do as the European Union? We can bring this innovative spirit to the whole continent. We build bridges from Bulgaria to Scandinavia, from Portugal to Greece, to make sure that if you're a young researcher in a university in Bucharest, and your customer sits in Spain, you find each other. And you find each other in a way that you find a common language, a common contractual framework, a common path to market, and ultimately a common way to make money.
Awesome. I would love to hear a story from the EIT, if you have some story on the back of your head, like from a startup that just entered the program, what they did in the program, or what was the interaction between the startup and the EIT, what happened, and what was the result and the impact. Because I believe many of people here today are looking for ways to scale their innovations, to create their company, to boost. And I think it would be a great story and example for them to have as a blueprint.
You're putting me on spot, Pedro. So we've supported about 10,000 startups over the 17 years of our existence. So picking one is really hard. I'll make my life easy, and I'll just pick the one which I visited last month in Romania, Bucharest. They're called Prime Batteries. What Prime does is they build batteries for grid-scale storage. And as you can imagine, this is a very critical technology nowadays for our security, for our resilience, for our green transition. Any way you look at this, we have a challenge on grid-scale storage. What they have done with the support of the KIC InnoEnergy, so one of the 9 verticals of EAT that focus on energy, they have started from a very simple lab-scale prototype and went through a series of upscaling to the current facility, which they've just completed outside Bucharest, which is an investment easily in the mid-3-digit of millions of euros. They benefited enormously from InnoEnergy because they found the industrial partners they needed. They found the Siemenses and Alstroms of the world. They found the utilities that they can test the grid on. They, of course, found academic partners. Now, they don't do just batteries. They do grid batteries. So it's not enough to get the chemistry of the coating right. You also need to get the software that integrates the power load into what comes from a wind farm and what's used in a tramway in Rotterdam. You also need to work with the whole manufacturing part of various parts, various kinds of materials. You need to have the regulation in place. Grid-scale batteries are not a simple business, but covering this complexity became a lot easier when they were part of an industry partnership. In InnoEnergy, everybody knows what they're talking about. Everybody knows the challenges, the opportunities, the differences between the countries. So suddenly they found themselves amongst friends that have the technological and commercial savvy. And I think this is where the example works really well.
Yeah, we see a lot of this happening in Beta E, because we see that when your final customer is some sort of a big corporation, as early as you start shaping your product in order to fill with the whole system of this corporation, like you said, even simple thing like an API to their systems, the more, the more efficient is the building of this company. And actually it becomes sort of a friend of the corporate where they can jointly together develop this commercial opportunity, because otherwise it will be impossible. So as soon as possible, cooperation is the way. And we believe that in Europe, well, actually we were talking about this outside, that we see a lot of funding being provided to not so central kind of countries or companies coming from these countries. Do you have an idea where, in terms of support geographically, the EIT has more footprint in Europe, if it's equally divided or more into, let's say, not so central countries? Can you share a bit of?
So we're committed to supporting innovators literally everywhere in Europe, and not even just the European Union. We some associated countries. We're committed to having regional innovation hub in every member state's capital. The Ljubljana one is just upstairs. It is, of course, also true, however, that we do find more need and more opportunities to support in the member states that are not in the middle of the continent. Some of it has to do with the attitude I spoke about before, with the more entrepreneurial, dynamic culture. Some of it, of course, has to do with the depth of markets. Some of it has to do with the more fragmented nature of research excellence. But it is very important for us to keep carrying the message to Brussels, to Berlin, to Paris, that really good deep tech knowledge can and is everywhere in Europe, and therefore success can and is everywhere in Europe. And bridging the fragmentation is what needs to be done there. So, yes, we are very active in some of the smaller countries, but that's because this is where you need to glue the ecosystems together.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are almost ending, but looking ahead into the future, how do you see the deep tech scene evolving in Europe? And what do you see is the path forward for these startups coming out from university? So basically, how can we boost more this commercialization of deep tech in Europe? How can we support them?
So I'm quite optimistic about deep tech in Europe. We have an inbuilt advantage in our diversity in that we can test the really money-making part of deep tech, the application, on a small scale before we go big. And that's a huge advantage over China and the US, where you have a single homogeneous market. If you fail really big. Now, here you can actually try things in a small scale and only then go big. We are very good at using this. We're very good at also comparing nodes, at having different experiences. So I think we'll go very big on maybe not the next LLM, but we'll go very big on the application of the next industrial robot and the next agent for services and logistics, on the next healthcare application. What we need to do to get there is we do need to keep working in the direction that was mentioned today a few times: over-compartmentation, simplify regulation, simplify access to funding. But first and foremost, collaborate between companies, big and small, collaborate with research, collaborate with public institutions, and smoothen this collaboration, create the contract frameworks, create the funding frameworks, the information frameworks, so that people like to work with each other.
Yeah, that's absolutely fundamental, and I think it's paramount for Europe to collaborate because, like you said, we are 27 plus with associated countries. We are so many different markets, different cultures, and also regulations. But that's also an advantage if we collaborate more. So it's not really that we are, enemies of each other. We are all helping each other, and if we try to cross these bridges, this creates so much richness when compared for US as well, because you kind of get to know different markets in a, let's say, friendly way. And I'm not sure if we have coming questions from the audience. I don't know if we have a pool going on.
It's very hard to see in the dark.
Yeah.
Do raise your hand if you want to.
If you want to share something. Is anyone in here worked already or has a startup that
I see something
interacted with the IT?
Right.
Okay. Sorry?
Interacted with the IT, not yet.
Okay.
But I have a question for tech implementation.
Let's go.
Yeah. So one thing is most of the time investors ask, what would you like to go first? What is your first POC like? How do you manage that conversation where you don't necessarily have control over where, because maybe the company that will use your product will decide whether to be that company. So how do you manage that question?
Did you got it? I didn't got all of it. Sorry, but have you written? Yeah. Okay. So maybe forcing scientists to become entrepreneurs is like asking poets to write user manuals. Technically possible, but soul crushing. Their calling is discovery, not distribution. Shouldn't they focus on science, not sales?
I think that's deeply unfair to scientists. I do actually think many scientists are entrepreneurs in their hearts, because if you're a good scientist, you do want to discover new things, you do want to try new things, and you actually have the appetite for risk to try things that could fail. Yeah, if you're looking at scientific discovery, you know very well that things may not work. Where I agree with Anonymous, it's a different training, it's a different aptitude, whether you think about money or whether you think about atoms. So my advice to any scientist is find a friend in the business faculty next door. Startups are more fun when you're doing them in a team anyway, and each of you can contribute what you're passionate about. And some of the best pitchers I've seen have an MBA and a PhD pitching in sync. So absolutely, don't betray your vocation. But I think the entrepreneurial spirit, that's you can find anywhere.
Yeah, just to add on that, almost I have the same feeling that the best pitches, the best companies come from scientists. But a lot has to do also with culture that you addressed here today, and how we have literacy on how to build companies. In US, for instance, well, everybody has the lemon stand at 6 years old. In Europe, that's not the case, and we start to learn about business very, very later on our careers, and that probably has something to do with the scientists not willing to do so much businesses as to do science. But I think that we do not need to change that, but we need to some sort of find a bridge for that science reach the market. And our time is up, unfortunately. I would like to thank Mr. Stefan Dobrev for your amazing insight. I would like to thank the audience. I would like to thank the Podim persons, and I would like to thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pedro, and we'll be around if you have more questions.